I'm Linda Coles, and this is Tell Us a Story. Jennifer Murphy is a certified personal and executive coach ruthlessly focused on helping people live awesome lives. She has launched 5 businesses, coached successful professionals to even higher levels of success, published a best-selling book, been deployed twice in combat scenarios, worked extensively with foreign governments, militaries, and in international business. She is the founder of No Limits Life Empowerment Institute. She's also a working glass artist, a partner at Shaman Grocer, an instructor at Kirkwood Community College, a Reiki master, and co-founder of the Midwest Reiki Festival. So she obviously keeps pretty busy. Her background includes 9 years as a US Army Ordnance Officer, 10 years as a leader in corporate America, and the last 6 leading her own businesses. Jennifer holds a BS in Criminology, which is something I'm excited to talk about. She's also got an MBA, a certificate in positive psychology, and is currently pursuing a Doctor of Executive Leadership in University in Charleston. So, goodness me, so much achieved and so much to do. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm great. I'm always very impressed with myself when I hear my biography, but I'll tell you, living my life does not feel that
Well, it's quite a varied background. I mean, you've done an awful lot of stuff there. So take us back, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Where were you then? Was that in the army, maybe? What were you doing?
Yeah, so I was honestly, at that time in my life, I was one of those that was just not quite sure what she wanted to be when she grew up, right? So I was kind of in that right around 19, 20 years old, not quite sure where I was going to go. And I had started, excuse me, I had started at a college and was a little bit aimless in what I wanted to major in. I didn't know where I wanted to focus my studies. And so I just started taking a bunch of liberal arts courses. Mm-hmm. And one of the courses I took was a introduction to constitutional law. And it was for the state that I lived in. And I became enthralled. I really became fascinated with the law and with all of the ins and outs and the nuances of it. And it just really attracted me. And I thought it was a very interesting field to explore. And that was really where I kind of decided there's something here for me, but I didn't yet know what it was. Mm-hmm. So that took me ultimately in between my sophomore and junior, so my second and third year of college, the Army called me and they said, hey, we will pay for the rest of your education if you will join us. And I was not one that had a lot of money for college. And so that sounded pretty darn good to me. So I did it, and that was about the amount of thought that went into it, quite honestly. I didn't debate it for days or weeks. I just said, yeah, let's do that. And so I went into the Army, and when I came back for my last couple of years at university, that was when I decided to go full in and declare my major as criminology and start pursuing that.
Okay, so you obviously went into combat a couple of times. Where did you go? Where was that?
Yeah, so right after September 11th of 2001, my unit deployed to the Afghanistan area of operations. And my unit was charged with establishing all of the logistics supply lines. So all of the ground, air, or rail routes that we could move supplies along. And we supported some special forces groups from when we first got there, and then eventually transitioned into the full kind of normal Army. We worked with Jordanian and French forces while we were there. And my job was literally to I was a little bit married to my computer during that time. I was making sure that I had my finger on the pulse of everything that anyone would need at any given scenario. And so making sure that we were getting food in from Europe and that was getting downrange to our warfighters that were in the farthest reaches of Afghanistan. and coordinating with our air forces, our foreign air forces as well, because we worked with a pretty global community of resources at that point, and then reporting status on that from the lowest levels all the way up to the commander, the general that was commanding all the forces in theater. So it was a challenging job. I look back on that experience, and it was quite surreal, to be honest, because, it's not often in my life that I can say that the decisions I made or the actions I took literally impacted someone's life. And during that time, I could say that, if I wasn't doing my job, then someone wasn't going to get something they needed in order to be successful or to make sure that they were safe. And so I took that very, very seriously. And that meant a lot to me. To be a part of something like that. And it taught me a lot about myself and who I was as a person and what I was capable of or not capable of in some instances, and really grow. And I think that experience just in and of itself really matured me as a person and as a leader, and and set me up for what was going to happen next in my life, really.
Well, it's such an important role and such an intricate role, I would think, as well. I mean, logistics is, for doing it for something in the Army, there must have been a million things that could possibly have fallen a wayside.
Yeah, there really was, because I was getting requests from everything from, yellow highlighters to to AA, AAA batteries, because the GPS units rely on batteries. And so just couldn't have enough batteries around. And then, all the way to, we need bullets, and we need ammunition, and we need food, and we need water. And yeah, so it was really, really pretty diverse set of things that I was dealing with. The second time around was when the Iraq conflict kicked off, and I had a really different role there. I served as a host nation liaison officer, and my primary role was to negotiate on behalf of our forces in country, to make sure that we had the real estate that we needed, the customs and immigration processes working the way that they needed to work, ensuring that when we had things happening, that those were negotiated properly with our host nation military. And so I had a very kind of diplomatic role at that point, which was, at first, I absolutely couldn't make the connection to, all right, what does this have to do with logistics? Why are you sending an ordnance officer in here to do this? Because this doesn't, I'm not seeing it. But it really boiled down to, again, putting that skill set to work. I've got so many moving pieces here, and they all have to sync up and align. They've all got to make sense at the end of the day, so that people can get to where they need to get to, or get the things through that they need to get through in order to achieve what we need to achieve in this arena. So, and I did both of those for just under a year, that I was involved in those deployments. And they were both just equally challenging, but I would say definitely the first one was more challenging just due to the austere conditions. But in both of those, I just look back and I think, God, that was in my lifetime.
Yeah,
I was part of that. It is a little mind-boggling.
So how did you get from there to corporate America then? I mean, did you sort of shift into logistics that way, or?
I did, and it was, I think I experienced what I've heard many other military members describe is, when I came back from deployment, I felt I didn't quite feel like I belonged anymore, and I didn't have the same sense of impact and the same sense of that things were right in the world. And it came from this place of extreme urgency. Things are very, very important. Everything means something, to an environment where there's maybe more pomp and circumstance and less sense of urgency and less sense of impact and meaning in what I was doing. And I was offered a couple of different paths within the military to pursue to try to maintain that sense of meaning. But I just felt like it was time for the next chapter, that I was ready to move on it and do something differently. And so I really just opened up. I very much opened up. I had been recently divorced, and it was literally just myself, and I had 2 Labrador retrievers that we could go anywhere in the world. And so we just opened ourselves up and I said, all right, dogs, where are we going? And we at a conference in Washington, D.C., and was recruited by a power company, a power generation company in the Midwest here in the States that wanted my skill set. They wanted a military officer who had that leadership background and experience, and they wanted someone who knew about maintenance. And I knew a lot about how to run a maintenance organization. So they recruited me, and I loved everything about the opportunity, except that it was in the Midwest in the United States, and I didn't want to live in the middle of the country. There was no attraction to live on a coast. And so that was 14 years ago. And so I've been here ever since then. But I was able to go in and make that transition. And, it was rocky. It was really rocky at first, because I was very used to an environment where I was the leader and I could instruct and lead and influence, and people did what I said based on my position in some cases. When I moved into corporate America, that was no longer the case. There was a really different relationship between leadership and followers. And so we had a very strong union in our power plant, and I just had to change my approach completely. And that took a little bit of trying to figure out, at first, identifying what is going on here. Why is this not working the way I'm used to it working? And two, how do I modify? Because I've never had to lead in this way before. And so I went through some great mentoring. I had a great leader who helped me get through that, and then really just fell in love with the position. And that transitioned into, it was a great stepping stone, because then I was recruited by a local aerospace and defense company to come in and do logistics planning for some military programs that they were a part of. I spent the next years planning in military programs and working in global strategy and working on programs just from all over the world with all kinds of different militaries and government organizations, traveling to different locations to work with our global subsidiaries, and really just enjoyed that. But after a while, I felt like I started to operate on a 7-year cycle. That after 7 years, it was time for another change. So I don't want to jump. I'll stop there.
So where are you now? And just before you answer that question, actually, where did the BS in criminology come in? Is that a bit later? Is that something you did since then? Or is that something you did while this was all going on as well?
I did that right before I went on active duty in the military. So the US Army has a program called ROTC. And you do ROTC while you're in college. So I did military training as a cadet in college, and I went to a couple different bases over the summer between semesters at college, and traveled to Korea for 8 weeks to do some training there, and was able to graduate with my degree in criminology, and then go into the Army as an officer. And when I was doing my degree in criminology, my emphasis was in law enforcement, because I've always had a keen sense of just deep curiosity. I want to know, why things are happening. I love mysteries. I love, in fiction, I love murder mysteries. This might make me sound really odd, but my favorite class in college was the class on serial killers, And what really fascinated me about it was the psychology behind it, the study of people behind it. Why do people do what they're doing? That people are often the greatest mystery, quite frankly, to unlock. And so as I pursued that, I was able to choose some internships with the police department, with a juvenile boot camp, where they send the juvenile offenders into this boot camp environment to try to instill self-discipline and basically kind of give them some different skills and different ways to think about themselves. I worked with some community service organizations with at-risk youth, and I worked in a women's prison quite briefly for one of my internships. And from all that, and from doing some ride-alongs and whatnot, I started to think, gosh, I don't know that I want to be a police officer. I don't know that that's my path, but I'm kind of committed right now. I'm in this program and I'm almost done. I've got to finish. And I loved everything about my field of study. But I wasn't sure how I wanted to pursue that as a career. And so really after I got my career, it didn't, or after I got my degree, it didn't really manifest in any direct way in my career, other than I had some great, discipline that was built out of getting that degree. What did happen, though, is when I showed up to my first assignment as a young lieutenant in the military, I got some background with my commander, and she said, "Oh, you've got a degree in criminology. That's great. I have the perfect unit for you." I swear immediately, right? And she said, and so she gave me this platoon. It had 65 soldiers in it, about half of which were on some sort of punishment, and so they were going basically to court. And so I had to, and there's different levels of court, and so a lot of these were just with the commander herself. But so I spent a lot of my first few months as an officer in my commander's office with my naughty soldiers who needed. She said, "This is perfect. You're used to it." So.
Oh, that's classic. That is. So at least you knew where they were coming from because you knew a little bit about how their minds worked.
Right.
So has that helped you in what you're doing now then?
I think it has, quite honestly, because, now I spend most of my time now as a life coach or an instructor. That's where I spend, the bulk of my active working time. And I think what it really helps me do is ask good questions. I have that natural curiosity, but studying some of the workings of the mind and maybe what drives us from a darker side I think is a really good contrast to a lot of what I find in our self-help community, which is really focused on, kind of the light side of that and the positive side, and, focus on the good and focus on the good. Well, there's also this darker side in a lot of us, and all of us, we have a grain of it. And I don't mean bad or evil or any of that, but there's some stuff that maybe we don't want to look at all the time. And I think, through my study in criminology in particular, I looked at a lot of that really ugly stuff with people, and none of my clients have it to the depth of a serial killer, for sure. There's but that willingness that I have on my behalf to just say, let's look at some of the ugly. Let's look at maybe the ugly side of this that I know maybe you don't want to look at, but we need to, just to get it out in the open so that it's not hiding. And you can get a good sense from people on that.
Yeah, and I write crime suspense in my part-time, if you like, as my hobby stroke future career, because it takes a little while to get established as an author of a particular genre. But that aside, I mean, the whole criminology, how people's mind works, the dark side, as you mentioned, just that little grain also of everybody's got it, like you say. And I've just sent one of my books off to the editor, and some of the comments she pops back are, "Man, I'm not sure how your mind works." Which is a compliment as well as a sort of oh dear, I thought my mind was just normal. But maybe we all have that feeling, and we all want to sort of go out there and have car rage and have I don't know, what would you do? Just pour milk in someone's car just to spite them when they've taken your car parking space. We've all got that little sort of
Devilment. We're getting vengeful, yes.
So you've got some sort of process, I'm gathering, then, that you work with when you work with clients, that you take them through?
I do, yes. So, and it originated really in kind of in the midst of my own personal apocalypse, is what I usually call it. Because when I decided to leave corporate America, I was at a point where my life, from the outside looking in, was perfect. I had a great job. I had a great husband. I had a great family. We lived in a nice home. I was well respected at work. I had a circle of friends. You would have called me crazy if I told you I didn't like it. But the truth was I didn't. And so what I had to really do, and I started actually working with a coach to answer these questions. And I'll never forget, when the first time I talked to her, she said, "Okay, so tell me what's going on." And I said, "Well, I don't like my job. And because I don't like my job, I don't like the rest of my life." And she said, "Okay, that's great. How's your marriage?" And I was like, "I don't want to talk about my marriage. I want to talk about my job." And And so what I finally understood what she was getting to is that, generally, that your life is influenced by the sum of its parts, right? So if you've got some angst in one area, chances are you've got some angst in another, because they tend to bleed together. We don't, as humans, it is very tough to compartmentalize strictly. And so whether we're conscious of it or not, they bleed together. And in working with her, one of the things I did as I was preparing for a call one night was I did basically a life inventory, and I wrote down everything I had going on in my life. And this is one of the processes that I work with my clients on, is just writing all of this stuff down and really getting a feel for what are all the things active in my life, energetically, physically, emotionally, financially, what is going on? And I had this big, long list of things, and I started to just categorize them and put them in groups, similar with similar. And from that, then I was able to label those groups. And what I ended up with by going through this process of categorizing everything I had going on in my life was I realized that I had essentially 5 main areas of my life that I was working in. And I had to ask myself, are those the most important things in my life? And is this where I want to be spending my time? Is this where I want to be spending my money, my emotional capital, my spiritual capital? And in some cases, yes. And in other cases, very clearly, no. And so I actually eliminated one of those big buckets as a result of that, and just decided that is not where I'm going to prioritize. I'm not going to make that one of the most important things. And in getting clear on those values, what I ended up with is I had this list of 4, which was my spiritual health, and then my son, the rest of my family, and then my business or my work life. And in getting really clear on just those are kind of big categories. There's a lot of things that could go into that. From there, once I was able to take that inventory and then identify those categories, I was able to decide what went into each of those categories. And so I was able to start eliminating some stuff that just didn't really fit in my life anymore. And also then add back in a couple of things maybe that I wanted to be doing. And so on the surface, that sounds like a very kind of simple exercise to do. But when you sit down to really do it, and now you're looking at things like volunteer time maybe that you do, or advocacy work that you might do, and you're deciding that's no longer fitting in your life or the life that you want to be living, that can be a hard conversation to have, not only with yourself, but then with the people that you have committed to work with that in. And my favorite story with that is that I had I was a big sister. We have a big brothers, big sisters program here where I was mentoring a child. And I would go and I would have lunch with him every week. And we would talk about his schoolwork and his home life. And I would give him advice, and we would play, and just gave him someone that he knew was on his side. And I knew that I wasn't showing up for that kid the way that he needed to be shown up for. And I wasn't able to get there consistently because of work travel and other conflicts. And he just wasn't getting the best from me. And so I called my manager, very nervous, but also knowing that I was doing the right thing in my heart, that I was doing the right thing. And I explained the situation to her, and she said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And I was like, "What?" His brothers and sisters are actually matched in a different way with another woman who literally just called this morning and asked if he could be placed with her.
Oh.
I just was like, that's amazing. What a great, way that something could work out. And what I remembered in that moment, and I think it's this knowledge that we all possess, and sometimes we just need to remember it, is that it's not always about me, first and foremost. That life is not always about us. And second, that when you say no to something, sometimes you create an opportunity for someone else. And that's fairly elementary advice, but it works out that way so many times, and it just makes so much sense. And I've seen that unfold that way at a couple different points in my life, but that was probably the most significant for me, when I just remembered this is the best thing for him, and this is working out fabulously. Like, I couldn't have asked for this to work out better. And so as you go through a process like that, and you start to shed that load, and you start to shed those things that aren't, maybe it's not fueling your soul, or it's not getting you closer to the life you want to be living, or it's quite literally maybe holding you back even. There's a unique experience with each one of those acts of letting go or bringing in that I think is worth it. And so it's, once you have that list of things you want to let go of, or the list of things that you want to bring in, it's action time. It's making that tough phone call. It's writing that resignation letter. It's, saying no to the needy friend that, you've developed a very lopsided relationship with, anything along those lines. And then what I tell people, kind of as I don't know that it's a final step, but it's it's the next step, is to continuously revisit your priorities. Because they may change, they may shift on a monthly, yearly. In some cases, that something that happens one week may shift the entire course of your life. This week forward. But it's so important to be very clear on what those priorities are, and very clear when you are offered opportunities, what you're going to say yes to and what you're going to say no to. And again, I'm reminded that seems so common sense, but I catch myself not operating that way sometimes, even though it's at the core of the work I do and the core of how I live my life. I catch myself saying yes to things. And then I think, why did I just say yes to that? I don't have time for that. It's nowhere in my list of priorities. It sounds fun. So maybe that's why I said yes, but I can't make that work. Why I need to pull back. And so it can be a challenge even when you're immersed in it, to remember something as simple as that.
I think it's kind of cool that you look at it. If you drop something, if you give something up, it can be somebody else's opportunity. And I'd never thought of it that way. So when you resign, somebody else will take that role. That could be a gift-wrapped opportunity for that person. And also, we don't set off with a life map, do we? I mean, you'll have worked to a plan when you were in all of your businesses, whether it was the Army, corporate America, or what you're doing now. You know where you want to go and what you want to do. But we don't tend to do that with our lives, and bumble along, I suppose, would be what most of us do, because we just do what we do.
Yeah, and I love to work with people on that, because we don't. We tend to just move from one experience to the next. And I can say, when I look back on my life, that's exactly what happened. I never intended to go into the Army. That was nowhere in my plan. I never intended to move to the Midwest. That was nowhere in my plan. And there's been so many things. I never intended to have one child. My original plan was we're going to have 5 or 10. I was going to I had one and was like, no, this is enough. I'm good.
Yeah.
So I do. And I think that we owe it to ourselves. Almost like, if you think about corporate strategy, there's a plan that gets laid out. You start to execute against that plan. You readjust it when you get new information or new things come up. You revisit it on a regular basis and make sure that it's the right plan for you still. You revise it on a regular basis. But we don't, as individuals, tend to grasp that cycle. We tend to be more reactive, to what's in front of us, instead of really thinking about, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of life am I creating? Where do I want to go from here? And then, really thinking about that and allowing that to unfold in a way that is conscious, and in some cases really planned, but at very worst, incredibly thoughtful. Where you're very aware of what's happening.
So, what do you say to those people that talk about work-life balance? Do you think there is such a thing?
I'm not a big believer in the phrase, and in part because it's gotten very, very diluted. It gets tossed around, and I think it's lost some of its meaning. So I don't like to use that. And when people come at me with, tell me how I can create more work-life balance, I say, well, first you can stop saying you want more work-life balance. And what we're going to do with is what kind of life do you want? Because your work is part of your life. And so moving away from I need to balance what I do at work with what I do at home, instead thinking about what kind of life do you want to be living? And your hobbies and your self-care and your family time and what you do for a profession, that's all part of it. And so let's look bigger picture. Let's look at our strategic vision. Let's look at this life that you want to be living, and what do we need to modify based on your day-to-day right now? What do we need to modify to get you closer to that? And then, there's some, from that point, I really love to use the analogy of a path, because from that point, you're laying your own pavers and you're putting down paving stones on a path, kind of one by one, in some cases, maybe 5 or 10 at a time, but, at least, sequentially, that are laying out the next set of opportunities. And so you can always pick a new pattern. You can always lay them in a different direction. You can always pick which way you're going to go. But when you're not quite sure which direction you want to head, it's very hard to take that step. And with a strategic vision, you've laid out, you use the term life map, and I think that that's really accurate. You've laid out this big map in front of yourself that shows you all these different places that you can go, but you've decided that is the orientation. And so you just make the next decision based on all the information that you have at hand, the culmination of the experiences that have brought you to that point, and you keep moving forward. And that's really where I like to stay away from that work-life balance, because I think the term implies a stagnation, that I can find this perfect position and everything will be fine. And I'm going to stay right there because everything's in balance. And I think that we're always moving forward. And quite honestly, I think sometimes there's beauty in the imbalance, I had a Dutch friend of mine, one time I was complaining because I said, I just don't feel like all my ducks are in a row. And he said, but Jennifer, sometimes those ducks are just beautiful and amusing and funny when they're just all running around amok. And I just stopped in my tracks and I was like, you're right. You're absolutely right. There is beauty in chaos. And stop worrying, it all perfectly in line, and just let it be sometimes. So I think there, if we're going to find balance, I think it's in that balance between chaos and forward movement versus work and life.
Yeah, no, that's nicely put, actually. That makes a lot of sense. Okie dokie. Well, let's ask you a couple of personal questions. Well, I say personal questions, interesting personal questions. What sort of things are you reading at the moment? Do you get much time to read?
I do. I'm a voracious reader. I can. And right now I'm balancing my reading load between a lot of reading for my doctoral program, a lot of reading on leadership. Our current text that we're reading is called Leading Minds, and the author's last name is Gardner. And I'm really enjoying that. He profiles 11 distinct leaders and some characteristics about them on a global basis, leaders from the last century. And so I'm finding that really fascinating and enjoying that a lot. I'm also reading a book on the Fibonacci sequence and the story of Fibonacci himself, which Fibonacci is a math sequence that most of us will learn in school. And it basically means that there's a number and it is the sum of the two numbers prior. And I became a little bit fascinated with that as I keep being drawn to the spiral that you'll find in a nautilus shell as like in the work that I'm doing. And so I just started becoming fascinated with Fibonacci and his life and where he came from with that. And so I've been reading that. And then just for what I call my mind candy read, right now I'm reading it's a paranormal romance novel. And so it's the Lords of the Underworld series. And I just, I read that at night when I'm just relaxing. And that's just my current series. And I've read it before. I decided I didn't want to dive into something new right now while I'm adjusting my brain to doctoral level reading. Yeah. I just wanted to read something I'd already read. So I'll be... after I finish that, I'll be diving into something similar in that realm, some nice murder mysteries or paranormal stuff. And it's just so different from what I do on a daily basis that I enjoy the departure. Yeah,
the opposite of what you're having to do for reading. Yes. Okay. And what would your one piece of advice be on absolutely anything at all in the world? What would it be? What stood you in good stead over the years?
Um, it's a simple phrase, and that is never settle.
Mm.
Um, really, really believe that you should always challenge yourself to go further, go faster, go deeper. Ask the next question, and don't settle for things at face value. Don't settle for where you are, because we live in this huge world. I mean, I'm talking to you from Iowa in the United States. You're across the globe. We've got this huge time difference. This is a huge world, and I believe that there's so much for us to go and explore and learn from each other and learn from our own experience, that I don't want anyone to settle and feel stuck. And it's a code I've lived by. I didn't realize for many years that was what I was living by, but it is. And just never settle.
Well, it's a nice note to finish on. Jennifer, where can people find out more about what you currently do?
Yeah, so the best place to start would be my website, which is www.nolimitslife.guru. And then that will take you into some different portals for Facebook groups or Facebook pages, other social media accounts. And there's a little form on there. You can send me a question if you have one.
Excellent. Okay. So that's nolimitslife.guru if anybody wants to look Jennifer up and find out a little bit more about who I was. That was really interesting, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Tell Us a Story. Why not subscribe or rate us next time you're on iTunes?